Welcome to today's masterclass. My name is Jose Rivera, and I will be your host today. We are CSIA, a global nonprofit trade association with over 500 member companies in 35 countries. For system integration members, the CSIA Best Practices Manual and CSIA certification are some of the more popular member benefits, but you will also enjoy a variety of others, including professional development, learning from your peers, and access to professional services experts, including insurance, financial, and legal, who understand the system integrator's unique business needs. For partner members, CSIA offers an ecosystem to grow your system integration program, understand your customer pain points, monitor industry trends, and share your thought leadership. The CSIA legal plan is administered by Faegre Drinker, with roots dating back to 1849 and 22 offices located in the US, UK, and China. The law firm is one of the 50 largest in the US, with more than 1,300 attorneys and consultants solving clients' most complex transactions, litigation, and regulatory challenges. The automation, system integration, and robotics lawyers at Faegre Drinker understand the legal and compliance issues affecting your industry. With thousands of qualified integrators and suppliers, the CSIA Industrial Automation Exchange helps system integrators, industry suppliers, and manufacturers connect and do business. For SIs and partners, it provides a platform to support your content and search engine optimization marketing efforts, position yourself as a thought leader, and nurture prospects during their complicated buyer's journey. The good news is that this is actually a great time of the year to join CSIA, because companies that join now will get the rest of 21 as well as all of 2022 included in their membership dues and any exchange upgrades or packages. Get all the details at www.controlsys.org/shine. And at this time, I would like to introduce Brian Clifford and BJ Knudson. Gentlemen.
Great. Thanks, Jose. Let me share my screen here. There we go. Great. Good morning for most of you. Good afternoon for a few of you. Happy to be here. We're going to talk today on the masterclass about dealing with supply chain issues in the current market. I am Brian Clifford. That's who's speaking right now. It's my lovely phone on the right, and for you, or on the left. Those of you who thought you were hearing from Mark Voigtman, my colleague this morning, I have a very special announcement. We have upgraded your presentation today. We have my colleague BJ Knudson, who is wonderful. We're very excited to have him here this morning. He's pinch hitting for Mark. For those of you who attend the CSI Executive Conference, you probably heard Mark and I speak enough times, so we thought we'd mix up a little bit, and BJ is going to be helping us here this morning. So to start off, I want to talk, we're going to move pretty fast today, and so I wanted to say, what are we talking about when we say current supply chain issues? Well, for those who attended the CSI Masterclass last week ago today at the same time, you already saw this slide. The demand remains strong in the United States. This is the U.S. non-defense capital good new orders and projected out through 23. You can see we're at record highs on these in the billions of dollars. And if you go on to the CSI website and you look at the easy stats, many of you are reporting that you are also very busy. If you look at this center pie chart, 45% of you say you're swamped. And you're not able to take on significant new work as of September of 2021. I think if anything, that's probably increased in October, though results aren't back yet. So when we're talking about supply chain issues, what we're really talking about is the economy has a high demand for your services and your expertise, and that all of you are reporting that you have limited ability to take on new work. So what are the supply chain specific issues that we're going to talk about here today? Well, one of them is going to be the availability of key equipment and materials for your project. We're going to talk about pricing volatility, which I think BJ and I both get about maybe a question every day or every other day on how to deal with that issue. And so we want to give you some tips and tricks on those concepts. We're going to talk about shipping congestion, which if you've looked at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, you have seen many articles about the ports and lack of trucking services to get things from point A to point B. We're going to talk about labor availability, and one is short term, dealing with COVID-19 restrictions and everything that's going along with that. And then also labor availability for long-term workforce issues. I think as we all have acknowledged for several years, we have a difficulty obtaining and retaining the talent that we need to provide the services that we want. So one thing I just wanted to note, these are issues that we're all dealing with. However, victory comes from finding opportunities and problems, right? So how does some of these supply chain issues impact you in a positive way before we deal with how to mitigate in the negative way? Well, there's reshoring, right? People are trying to shorten their supply chains. There's a lot of interest, especially for you in manufacturing industries that are serving those clients, to shorten those supply chains, reshore things into the local markets, and that gives an opportunity for you to pitch new work. There's also diversification of suppliers, kind of not putting all your eggs in one basket. So there's going to be a lot more potential customers, not just the ones you already have who are looking to move more operations into the areas that you have ability to provide services, but also more potential customers in those markets because the diversification of suppliers is something many companies are interested in. And then, of course, we have labor shortage. We have had a labor shortage for a while. Automation or robotic solutions can help mitigate the problems that your clients and customers are having with their labor shortages. And also the new workers, the people who are coming in, whether we're calling them Gen Z or whatever the current iteration of that, their skill sets and their interests are compatible with some of the things that you're seeing in the industry. So, we may have an opportunity to capture some of that new workforce to provide solutions to their clients. So as we talk about these issues today and kind of go through those items we went through, we're going to split it basically up into half. We're going to have strategies in advance of the problem, where we're basically trying to figure out what we do before this problem arises. Always a good idea, right? Trying to stay out ahead of things. But the reality is that some of these things you just can't expect. For example, some of the problems with the ports and the shipping issues that are coming in, I don't think a lot of us anticipated that. And so you may have to deal with things after they emerge. You can't kind of go back and rewrite your contract, for example. You got to deal with it as it comes. So we're going to go through and give you some usable tools on both of those to talk about today. And when we talk about those issues, right, we're going to talk about customer communications in advance of the problems. We're going to talk about subcontractor and supplier communications. We're going to talk about your contracts. And after, we're going to talk about, again, same sort of thing. Can't deal with the contracts. Those are already signed and executed, but we can deal with customer communications and subcontractor and supplier communications. One additional note before I throw it over to BJ, if you have questions, like I said, we're going to move pretty fast this morning. We have a lot of material that we would like to cover, but how this is the most beneficial is if you get the questions that you have answered. So we would love to hear from you. We want to make this as interactive as possible. Obviously, there's a limit to how much is available in a remote platform when we're all using Zoom, but you can use both the Q&A feature on Zoom as well as the chat features. And I will try to monitor those and either answer your questions as we go, or we can answer some at the end as well. And we'll try to reserve some time back for that. So we know what you're seeing every day. We're only hearing a small slice, BJ and I, so we want to make sure that we can answer the questions that you have. So feel free to share those at any time. Just add them to the chat, add them to the Q&A, and we will address those. So BJ, I'll throw it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Well, I am delighted to be here. And that was a nice introduction referring to an upgrade. I shall do my best. I don't know if we can really call this an upgrade, but I shall do my best. So let's talk about some of the front end issues that you can do and some of the front end strategies that you can use in light of the climate that Brian just described. So one of the main things is availability of key equipment and materials. We need to be thinking about this every time we're entering into our contracts with project owners. And so one of the things that we really want to make sure happens is that in your contract, you align the commitments of your vendors prior to your proposal to the project owner. So if, for instance, a vendor that you know doesn't have certain type of equipment or isn't able to guarantee a price for that equipment, that needs to align with what's in your proposal. We just have to have complete alignment. Otherwise, you are going to be stuck in the middle and responsible for some of those gaps. The other thing we want to make sure that you're doing is reducing the hold open period for the proposal or pricing schedule. So, if you are having to hold open your proposal or pricing for a period that's much longer than the vendors that you're working with, or is for any real extended period of time, you're going to be at risk for some of the fluctuations and volatility that we've seen in the market. And so the way to reduce the risk is to, of course, reduce that hold open period so that you're, of course, locking in your vendors, but also locking in that price with the owner right away so that there is complete alignment. The other thing that you want to, one strategy that you might want to use when you're working on the front end with these contracts is to include some assumptions and clarifications about the issues that we're talking about here today, and in particular, the availability of key equipment and materials. One of the assumptions that you're going to make when you enter into these contracts are that the materials will be available for you, or that you're going to be able to procure them under normal circumstances. And if that assumption doesn't turn out to be true, then you should be able to receive an increase in the contract sum or the contract time, or both. So I think one of the things that we have seen a lot of people use successfully are detailed and very robust assumptions and clarifications. These happen to be things that owners may not focus on, project owners may not focus on, and some of the parties that you're contracting with may not focus on to the same degree that they would, say, a legal term in the agreement. They may look at this and be more willing to agree to an assumption or clarification that talks about the availability of equipment and materials. So we want you to use that to your advantage. The other thing that we want to make sure that you've got in your front end are substitution clauses or as equal provisions. Essentially, these clauses give you an opportunity to find a different piece of equipment or material that is of equal value or equal quality to the one that you may have specified in your contract or as part of your proposal. So if that original piece of equipment that you have specified isn't available or doesn't become available, or you've got a defaulting subcontractor who simply isn't going to honor the contractual requirements that you have imposed upon that person, you will have this clause in here that can allow you to substitute for a different and equivalent product or good. So those are, of course, some of the front end things that you'll want to be looking for and try to incorporate into the contract. Other things that we think you can utilize very early on in the process and in your contracts are clear force majeure provisions that talk about the availability of equipment and materials. You've got to have a force majeure provision that, and we recommend addressing this issue head on, saying that you are entitled to an extension of time for a force majeure event and then not defining what that force majeure event is could lead things open to disputes. And we don't want to necessarily do that. So we recommend having a very clear statement in there that, shortages of equipment or unavailability of goods or delays in receipt of goods, those types of things should be called out specifically in your force majeure provision. And that provision should do two things. It's got to extend the time period for you to perform, and it's got to give you increased compensation for that delay. Because, of course, I think just increasing the time period, that's not enough. you may be on the job longer, and you may be incurring additional expenses, and you may actually have to incur additional expenses to obtain this additional material or to substitute additional material for material that is currently unavailable. So those are two really key things that you want to make sure are included in your force majeure clause. Other things, and is this other things, I think, do I turn this back over to you, Brian? I think I do on this one.
You do indeed. I want to talk, so that's on the availability of equipment and materials. I want to talk about pricing volatility. This is probably, and BJ will probably agree with me, probably the question that I get the most frequent right now is, how do I deal with this very dynamic environment in which something that I called about pricing this morning changed in price by this afternoon, or something that I quoted last week needs to change because of what happens in the next couple of days. So one of the easy ways to deal with this are allowances. Right? We've had these in the industry for a long time. Allowances are different than what you may give your child, and that their allowance for them hopefully is fixed. Doesn't change a whole lot, but allowances within a contract and the environment that we're working on, it's basically a placeholder amount. It's saying, this is why I expect this piece of equipment, this scope of work, this particular item to cost. It's in the budget now. If it ends up going over that amount for really any reason, then owner, you'll pay me more. If it comes in under that amount, I'll essentially give you the benefit. I'll give you the rebate. It's really just a placeholder number for which you are not taking on the risk of pricing volatility. So one way to deal with this is if there's an item that you just feel like you can't price in the time that the owner needs you to price it, to give a proposal, to sign an agreement, you may have to set up some of those items as allowances. Another way to deal with it is with contingencies. All right, so here's all the schedule of values, our budget, here are all the line items. There's going to be an item in here that's for a contingency, just things that we don't know, price escalation that we can't anticipate right now. It's basically a bucket of money or a slush fund that can go and sort of even out some of the outliers when you end up going and securing your subcontracts, doing your purchase orders, getting your equipment. And that can either be an explicit line item, in other words, a specific amount within the budget, or it can just be embedded. So every single line item has a 5% markup in there that this is when you did your takeoffs, you did your estimating, this is what you thought it was going to cost, and you kind of gave yourself a little bit of cushion. And there's advantages and disadvantages on both. Some owners obviously want to see kind of how you got there. They want to make sure that they also, most owners don't want you to lose money. It's not a good long-term business strategy, because you'll be scraping and clawing for every single penny on change orders or requests. So not all, but most, I think, want to be fair, and they frankly want to make sure that you've accounted for those, because they're accounting for them, and they want to see more visibility. So having an explicit budget line item that says this is a contingency for potential cost escalations between the time that we gave you our proposal or the time we signed the contract and when we can actually get commitments from vendors, suppliers, and subcontractors. Other ones, frankly, don't want to see how the sausage is made, and frankly might fight with you and say, well, I don't want a contingency in here. That's just slush fund money. Well, you still need it, so you may have to embed it in the line items and not be quite as explicit. So allowances and contingencies are two contractual ways to deal with pricing volatility. Another way is say, hey, look, if you think I can price this so accurately and I disagree, why don't you buy it? Right? And there can be owner provided items. If you have, you're doing a distillery project, for example, or some sort of food and beverage project, there's a big tank that, given stainless steel pricing, you just don't feel like you can give an accurate number, and the owner's demanding it, saying, well, how about you purchase it? I'll do all the work around it. I'll install it. Here's when I need it by, and you guys go. It saves them the markup. You also lose the markup, but then you don't take on the risk of pricing volatility on that item. And that sometimes, even if you don't end up getting that term that they still want you to provide it, it can reset the discussion with your counterparty on why you think it's important to either have an allowance or have a contingency, because you can kind of point out, well, if you're not willing to take on that pricing risk, why do you expect me to be able to do so, given the current market environment that we have? And then in some circumstances, we just have price escalation provisions. And these are some of the most complicated and difficult provisions to negotiate in a contract. But when they're in there, they can be incredibly powerful. They are generally mutually beneficial to both parties, which I think BJ and I both are of the view that Our job is to get parties to yes, as opposed to only telling people no. So, we like these provisions where appropriate to deal with this issue. And one of the ways that we can do it is by specific project components. To use the example from before, there's a stainless steel tank. I think it's going to be $230,000. But if it goes up by more than 5% of that, then I get to go to the owner to pay that difference. I'll take on the first 5% of cost escalation, but nothing past that. You could also do it by all project materials of a certain type. So not just that tank, but all stainless steel products, for example, or all certain types of motherboards or certain types of PCLs. These are what we're expecting this to come in at. If it comes in over, then we need a price adjustment. It could just be all materials, right? All items on the project, more difficult, but could be there. Or you could do it for all labor, which I think these are probably the most unusual. Most time when people are talking about price escalation provisions, they're really talking about physical equipment, right? The goods that go into a project, all the components. They're not really talking about escalation in your labor expenses. Those are real, and we are dealing with those. Obviously, it's a stressed labor environment. And so there's generally inflationary pressures on labor rates, but it's less common, I think, in our experience to have a price escalation provision dealing with labor costs, but not impossible. Certainly able to negotiate that in the appropriate circumstances. And so if you're going to have one of these provisions, one of the things you have to look at is like, well, what's the baseline, right? In order to show a price escalation, you have to show it went up from something. So you need to establish the baseline in the budget. Otherwise, you're going to spend as much time fighting about whether a price escalation occurred as you will fighting about what the impact of that should be. So to use the tank example, if we said it was $230,000, let's state that explicitly or use some sort of document reference. Here's what the supplier told us it would be. Here's their proposal. Here's what they sent to us. And then you obviously, once you have the baseline, you got to determine what the final cost would be. The easiest way is actual cost. In the tank example, we said it was $230,000. Here's what the manufacturer of that tank is willing to ship it for. It's $242,000. We have a $12,000 price escalation. Pretty simple. Another way is to use some sort of more objective number, right? Some sort of index rate. And if you're talking about, for example, before we were talking about trying to do it for all steel products or stainless steel products or copper products or aluminum, there are index rates that you can find in the marketplace that would say this is how this is moving, basically on spot pricing. And you could use that and say, all stainless steel went up 5%. We need to have a 5% increase in all of those line items. So that's the other way to have that. And then obviously there's going to be some discussions on a price escalation provision about whether or not it's inclusive or exclusive of your overhead and profit, right? So that let's not lose the fact that we're all in this business to make some amount of money. So, just doing things at cost, not necessarily a good long-term strategy. It's great not to lose money, but let's also try to make money every once in a while. And so figuring out how you're going to calculate profit, fee, markup, whatever you call it, and how that works in with these price escalations are in there. So in other words, you only get fee on the base price, but not the escalated price, or do you get fee on both? That's the basic way to look at it. So those are kind of all the positive sides. If you're on the other side of this and somebody's coming to you with a price escalation provision, a couple of things you might want to look at. Is there a limitation or some sort of circuit breaker, right? I'm willing to pay I'll take on some price escalation risk up to 15%. But once it's over 15%, I just can't do it. I need to shift that risk to somebody else. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about, these sort of circuit breakers. And the other way to do it could be a cap on the price. So if you have a vendor coming to you and saying, I can't price it for you accurately today, I can give you today's price, but that's not necessarily what I'm willing to ship on. Similar to a circuit breaker, can they at least give you a cap? And so they're saying, look, this may go up 6% or 8% or 9%, but in no event will it go over this. And that might be a way for you to have then that corresponding conversation with your customer that can, basically, as BJ was indicating before, try to align what people are providing to you for the things that you need to do the project and what you're able then to provide the end user or the customer. So just a break, don't forget to use the Q&A or the chat features if you have some questions. We're about 25 minutes in, so We'll be getting to Q&A here in probably another 20 or 25 minutes. So have those queued up and we'll continue to monitor those. And with that, I'm going to send it over to BJ to talk about some shipping issues.
Well, shipping issues have been one of the biggest issues that I think clients in your industry are facing. I will say that it's really across multiple industries. Getting the materials to the job site, getting things moved from one place to another has been difficult. It has really been difficult. And you can see this illustration here. This is an actual picture that Brian was able to capture and include in the materials here. This is the port of Los Angeles. This is very real, and it's happening a lot. And it's something that we want you to be thinking about every time you're entering into a contract. And so with that, we want to make sure that your force majeure provision addresses delays in the delivery of materials, supply chain disruption, shipping issues, things that are very real and are not within your responsibility. This is something that we want to make sure gets included in the force majeure provision so that you get an extension of time and additional money in the event that you run into shipping issues. And we've seen it really on so many jobs where key pieces of equipment are not delivered on time. And that will cause a ripple effect. So we've got to get that into our force majeure provision. And then the other thing that we want to make sure that you're doing is including the substitutions clause or the as equals clause, which I mentioned earlier. Perhaps there is a difficulty in getting one particular piece of material shipped, but maybe you can get an equivalent material shipped much sooner. Excuse me. That is, I think, a powerful thing that you can do so that you don't even have to use and rely upon the force majeure provision. You can just substitute an equal or equivalent product at any time. So those are a couple of strategies to deal with the shipping issues and the shipping congestion. The other thing is labor availability. This is really critical right now. We have seen many projects get delayed because they couldn't get enough people there. And so I think this is an essential piece for your force majeure provision. It's not just a shortage of materials or a shortage of goods. It's also a shortage of labor or labor unavailability. And this can be for a number of reasons. One is due to, COVID restrictions. There may be governmental health and safety rules that prohibit the number of people that are in a particular area. That was very big during the beginning of the pandemic. I think it's lightened up in some cases, but restrictions may come back. There may be some governmental health and safety rules that make it so that it's impossible for you to get as many people in one spot as you wish. The other is customer-specific health and safety rules. Gosh, we know our customers have their own set of rules that in some instances are even more strict than governmental health and safety rules. And they may restrict the number of people who are going to be available to be in a site at one particular time. The other thing that we've seen are direct staff illness or quarantine. Look, there are breakouts that happen on projects. We know this. This is something that's very difficult for us to control. And so we want to make sure that in your force majeure provision, you're addressing the idea that if people get sick on the job and you're not able to get enough labor to that job, that you're getting an extension of time. And then, of course, there are these remote impacts, which, I view as the manufacturing facility that you've hired to help manufacture some of the goods has an outbreak or has a restriction placed on it, or is not able to have enough labor there. These remote impacts will directly impact your project and the work that you're doing at the site. So we want to make sure that a force majeure provision covers all of these different types of labor availability impacts. So one thing that we do on our end is we try and track these things. We try and track what the government is doing and what restrictions are in place. What are the OSHA regulations? What are the state laws? What are even the local laws which sometimes can even be more restrictive than overall state laws. We try to track this in a resource center that's handy for our clients. And so we wanted to make sure that we included this in the materials so that you could just go to our resource center, and that may be helpful to see what some restrictions are out there. And so, obviously feel free to contact any one of us, but we also have this available for your use and resources.
And following up on what BJ is talking about short-term labor availability, obviously we've been struggling with labor availability well before COVID and all the restrictions and vaccination policies and everything else that goes along with this. So there's no reason your force majeure provision can't cover both. And in fact, we think that they should. And so when we're dealing with long-term workforce issues, we want these provisions to be broad enough to, yes, deal with the fact that, we had an outbreak, one of our key subcontractors had an outbreak. The project lead that we really need has particular expertise. He has to quarantine or she has to quarantine because of an outbreak in their family. Of course, those should all be covered, and that is a part of the new normal. But also just dealing with longer term workforce issues, we would like to have these included in our force majeure provision. Also, subcontracting rights. As you guys know, many of the contracts that you're receiving, especially from large institutional owners and manufacturers, may say you can't subcontract any of the work without our explicit prior written consent. Well, do you need to loosen those up or get some of that consent early, because you may need to bring in other people outside of your company to help supplement your own workforce in the event that you have an issue. Jose and I were talking about earlier about there's a lot of interest now that we're kind of in this more globalized world even than before. There's interest in for example, Latin American, South American companies who are CSIA members wanting to have opportunities in North America, have the right expertise, have the right experience, have the right abilities, but can you actually bring them in to help supplement, help do your work in a way that's mutually beneficial? Or is your upstream contract with your counterparty, your owner, going to prohibit that? And then look, the best way to deal with long-term workforce issues is to be able to retain the talent that we have. I mean, it's very hard to get new employees in. I think we all have dealt with that. But keeping the great employees and the great workforce that we have now is one of the easiest ways to start to address that. So, working with your HR team, working with your people, working with consultants to figure out what is the best way to keep the talent that I have, that I need to keep doing my work, so I don't have to use a force majeure provision to say, hey, 3 of my best programmers quit last month. Right? So let's try to keep the talent that we have. And then let's think about talent development. Obviously, one way is to hire new people, but you have people who are on your staff now who can be trained to do more things, to kind of skill up, level up their own ability. You already have them in the door. They already like you enough where they haven't left so far. Can you broaden the opportunities that they have to do more work for your customers in a way that's going to help? And that's another way to look at it. I think we focus so much when we talk about talent on trying to bring new people in. And sometimes we lose sight of the idea of keeping the great people that we have and getting some of those people to be able to do more things. So I want to pause here. We did have a question that was asked. Thanks, Jason. It says the majority of our clients' terms and conditions explicitly state that the only project documents are their PO, T's and C's, etc., and basically state that RTCs are null and void. How do we make sure our force majeure terms are still applicable? Great question. We deal with this a lot. If you were at, I think the CSIA conference might have been in Puerto Rico, I think I gave a presentation on what's called the Battle of the Forms, which is where you send your proposal, it has your terms and conditions, they send their purchase order, has their terms and conditions, and now you're fighting about whose control. So I have a particular issue or interest in that issue. When people say these sort of things, saying ours are only controlled, that's fine, but that's not necessarily going to be applicable, right? Parties can always agree to amend their agreement, and that includes a term that says you can't amend the agreement. So that's one of these weird sort of things that people who aren't in the field may not realize. So, one way to do it is to basically, it's kind of the last shot rule. The last person to speak on an issue like this may end up controlling. That's pretty common. Every time somebody sends their terms, it's considered a counteroffer, right? I proposed this, you counteroffered that. I'm going to re-counter offer something else, and the last person to stop talking kind of wins. That's one way. Obviously, that can lead to disputes. And so just make sure your force majeure, if you really want to have the clarity, to make sure that your force majeure provisions are applicable, to get them actually in the T's and C's or in the PO is the best way to do it. And that can be tough. I think both BJ and I would probably agree. I think Mark would as well. And the rest of the automation and robotics members here at the firm probably say, better have this fight up front than to have it later. It's always going to cost you less in both your time and effort and potentially legal fees to negotiate an equitable and fair term at the front end of a project, as we've been talking about here, strategies in advance of the problem, than it is to try to deal with it once it happens. And so I think getting something where it says, we'll agree to all your terms and conditions, we'll agree to your net 1,000-day payment terms, and you'll never pay us interest, and all these other things. All right, fine. We can all make business decisions about that. But look, I cannot control things that are by definition outside of my control. That's really what force majeure means. You got to work with me here. I can take on some risk, but I can't take on all risk or unlimited risk. And the best way to do that is to have an explicit discussion. And sometimes we actually see that the T's and C's will be accepted, but the purchase order will have some, bottom of the page, a couple asterisks, and then saying one sentence or two sentences or a paragraph that deals with that specific issue. The other way is what BJ was talking about before. Sometimes the only real way to do this is through assumptions and clarifications, and that the legal terms may get more closely looked at through a legal department or some sort of outside law firm. But the clarifications and assumptions built into the proposal, the actual scope of work, may not be reviewed, or at least might not be reviewed by the same group. And you may have more ability to say, look, we're basing our proposal on these conditions. And if they don't, then we need to change the scope. And we can negotiate how that impacts it with time, with money, whatever else, but that may be a strategy to use. So we've, hopefully that answers the question. Thanks for that. So we've been dealing so far with obviously the strategies in advance of the problem. We want to move at this point, talk about some of the strategies after the emergence of the problem. And with that, I'm going to turn it over again to BJ.
Yes. So now we have moved on from the contract stage, contract negotiation stage, to now we're doing the work, and we have a negotiated contract already. We've, hopefully got our good terms in there that give us opportunities for extensions of time and additional money in the event of force majeure things. But that doesn't end things. Now we have to make sure that we are following the contract. And so there are a couple of things. The first thing is we got to make sure that you're noticing the problem when it arises. And really, there's sort of two ways that this notice occurs. There's sort of the loss-oriented notice and the event-oriented notice. Now, loss-oriented notice, what we mean by that is basically you notice that there is a problem that is occurring. Why are you over budget? Somebody is noticing that all of a sudden there's a huge spike, and you've spent more than what you thought you would, or you're getting behind schedule. You're not hitting the metrics and the marks that you thought you would on the schedule, or simply the customer's coming to you and saying things aren't going well. These are things that will then trigger someone to notice that there is a problem, and you will then likely investigate and find out, gosh, some of these costs are because of shipping issues or some of these things that are happening. So loss oriented is not our favorite. That is bad, because the event has already occurred and we have already started incurring losses. The other thing and this is the more ideal situation, is the event oriented notice. This is when you notice an event has occurred that will result in some sort of loss or will result in some sort of delay. So once you see the event, then you have to determine, okay, how is this going to impact us? How is it going to impact our cost? How is it going to impact our schedule? And what are the things that we need to talk to the customer about? What are the customer issues that we've got to do? Then now you can start putting together your notice. Now you can start, looking at your contract and really really starting to figure this out. Hopefully it is an event-oriented situation that you have discovered. So when that happens, you've got to research the issue. You've got to talk with your counsel. You've got to figure out, what's really going on here and get to the bottom of it. That's then going to inform what you put in the notice to the customer. You're going to look at your contract, and you're probably going to have some sort of obligation to give notice after the event occurs or after you notice that the event has occurred. And this is key. We see so many of our clients, and so many times people don't take the step of actually notifying the customer in the way that the contract requires and within the time period that the contract requires. And this is critical. The contracts that you're likely being presented from your customers are saying that you have to give notice, likely within some unreasonable period of time, within like 3 days of when you find out about the problem or when the problem has occurred. So you've got to do it quickly. And there's likely a procedure by which you have to give notice. It has to be by mail or by overnight mail or return receipt requested. And it has to go to a specific person. This is usually always in your contract. And project owners will make this difficult for you. They will make the notice provisions as detailed and specific as possible, and will likely say, if you don't do it this way, you waive your claim. And we have seen a lot of our own clients have to relinquish pieces of their claim because they did not give notice in the way that they were supposed to under the contract. So very, very critical to do so. Now, why is there such a reluctance to give notice? Well, sometimes we hear from our clients that they don't want to make the owner upset. They don't want to, be super confrontational with the owner. And notice does not need to be confrontational. It does not need to be something that is bad. You can follow the contract in such a way so that you're sticking up for your rights and following the contract without being a jerk about it. And that's where in our slides here we have that adversarial is not the same as confrontational. Confrontational is, hey owner, I need money. I need it now. Let's go, quit stalling. That is probably not what you want to lead with. You're leading with, hey, we've encountered an issue on the project that we wanted to let you know about. And in fact, we've already talked about it with you because oftentimes we're in constant communications with the owner, and we just want to make sure we're documenting that. So I think it's really important to, have those conversations with the owner and make sure that you are documenting it in writing in accordance with the contract, because those conversations are not enough. Other things to be thinking about are the proposal, what we want to what we want to do. And I think in the notice, we want to make sure that we're coming up with a solution, that we're actually proposing a result that is in line with what we're entitled to under the contract. I think that's oftentimes a very important thing. Making sure that you're documenting it and including any documents that are necessary to help support your claim. You can do that in the notice or immediately thereafter. And, ultimately, what we want to make sure is happening is that you are not limiting yourself or not doing things in your notice that is going to close off claims or that are, is going to impact your ability to recover any amounts if there is a dispute. So ultimately, what you want to make sure you're doing is sticking to the language and making sure that you are following in line with the contract. And Brian's got a nice summary here in the slides that your communication, it just has to be prompt and also accurate. You also should in your notice and should in your communications always refer back to the contract itself. You want to make sure that you're citing the provision that you're invoking. If it's the force majeure clause, let's make sure that we're being specific about that. That's also a helpful way to make sure that we're not, making the owner upset or angry. What we're saying is, hey, owner, you agreed to this. We all agreed to this. Let me remind you of that. And that's not an issue usually for most reasonable owners. And then you want to engage, of course, in the problem solving, the things that you're going to do to try and mitigate this, delay or this event. That is something that is also in many contracts where you have a duty to mitigate your losses and a duty to mitigate your delays. And so I think ultimately those are the things that we would want to see in your communications with customers and in your notice. Avoiding limiting language is super key. If you're just saying the only reason that we're asking for a delay is because of a shipping issue, but there are also other things that are sort of related to that shipping issue, like pricing or shortage of materials or, other things, you can say, hey, we've been delayed for a number of issues, including, but not limited to, shipping issues or, labor issues or things like that. That makes it so that you're hedging a little bit. You've got a little bit of wiggle room in the event that there are also some other things that are contributing to the delay. So that's very critical.
And there's a note in the chat about how sometimes getting customers to move on their terms and conditions is like moving a mountain. And we agree that's the struggle that I think BJ and I both have. We do a lot of contract negotiation on behalf of clients, and that's a very difficult thing. And, sometimes it's the my way or the highway. There's a lot of downsides of that. Obviously, if you don't have enough leverage, it's hard to get some of those terms to be carved back to more reasonable. The upside then, however, is that you can tell when you have to give a notice and saying, look, you made me do this. Like, you gave me these terms. You required me to give you this written documentation. We've talked about this in the field. All the project team is aware of it, but your contract requires me to do these things. And that can help reduce the sort of difference between being adversarial, where, we want something that they may not want to give us, to be confrontational, right? I mean, we're trying to avoid that and saying, look, all we're doing is exactly what you asked. And I think, as many people know, I do kind of both sides. I represent a lot of automation and robotics vendors and suppliers and service providers. I also represent some owners who are hiring people. So I see it on both sides. And what I try to convince is saying, look, I want to know, as the owner, I want to know what's going on with my project, because I have stakeholders who I need to report to, a board of directors or a manager or something, and they need to understand. So if you don't tell me information promptly and accurately, citing what's going on in the job, I can't communicate that to my stakeholders, and you're putting me in a bad situation. So I think crafting your notices, crafting your communications in a way, after you've noticed the emergence of a problem, to say, I want to give you everything that I can, that I know about today, to allow you to tell people that you need to tell. I think that can be a good way to do that. One of the things that the CSA is concentrating on is saying, look, when we do these master classes, let's take things that we can actually take away from this, like what's real tools. Hopefully we've provided a lot, but to even drive the point a little further home, I want to look at a couple of examples of communications with customers that kind of follow these strategies. So I'm going to advance the slide here. Here is an email, delayed PLCs, right, from Needs Help Automation Corp. As you can see, we're going to make some improvements here. It says, look, here's how we're going to make up for the shipping delays last month. Sorry, can't do any better than this right now. All right, this is an email. We see a lot. This isn't an actual email, but it's paraphrased, but not that far apart from what we often see when clients contact us and say, hey, can you help me get some relief here for this problem? So going through the strategies that we just looked through, how can we make this email better? All right, here's a new one. How is this different? All right, let's point out a couple. So first, force majeure event. We changed it from delayed PLCs. Now we're actually using the language of the contract, saying here's what we're really talking about. We're talking about force majeure event. That's in the subject. What else? Last time we were saying these are the shipping delays that happened last month. Well, it's a little late. To BJ's point before about the difference between being loss oriented, we see now that we're very behind schedule compared to being event oriented. This week, last week, we've had a disruption. How is that going to impact us projecting into the future? Much easier to have that discussion when you can be prompt. How else is this one different? Well, we've had an unforeseen supply disruption, right? The last one basically said, our shipper screwed up. We didn't get things in time. This was something that, as to us, yes, that's still what happened. Our shipment did not arrive when we expected to, but as unforeseen, it's something that was outside of our control. We're basically using force majeure type of language to indicate this. How else? Well, ask for what you want. The last one said, this is the best we can do. This is when your project's going to be done. You didn't actually ask for any relief. This one says, look, take a look at the schedule. We're proposing a solution. As BJ said, we're not just raising problems. We're also providing solutions. And the schedule includes an extension of time in accordance with our contract. This is what we're actually asking you for. That's probably what your contract calls for. You need to ask for the relief. And how else is it different? Well, be engaging. Right? I don't think many owners who you're dealing with want to kind of be dictated to. They want to feel like they're a part of the project. They want to feel like they're involved. They want to feel like they have some agency. They want to feel like they have decision making. And so this is how we're proposing it, but we want to engage you in this discussion. And some of the best ways, obviously Susan's not going to love this. She expected the project to be done, November 10th. It's now not going to be done until November 25th. So she's not going to love this news, but she feels like she's engaged with it, that she feels like she gets the opportunity to weigh in and say, well, what about this? What about that? You can get her to be an ally for you and say, hey, look, I've worked with the team. This is what has happened. The automation robotics vendor, you're our customer here. We've all worked this out, and this is the best way forward for the team. And so I think engaging somebody and being more proactive in the solution, asking for their feedback is good. And what else? We didn't limit it. To BJ's point before, we didn't say this is the only thing. So look, this is what we know today. We're providing you this week's information. That's not saying we're not going to have any other supply chain disruptions, right? This is something that's an ongoing problem. We'll keep you updated on any further impacts. We haven't kind of closed off that this is the end all and be of all requests that we're going to have for additional time. So just a couple other notes about communications with customers. On these, I think having email hygiene. If you've heard Mark speak at some of the CSA executive conferences, you've heard him use this term as well. I think what we're really talking about is if there is an arbitration or a lawsuit, and obviously the goal is to avoid this, but if you have $1 million bust on a project and you need some relief under your force majeure provision or a price escalation provision, and it turns into a dispute, every single internal email between you and your team is going to come out. And so think about whether or not you would like that to be presented to your customer. I think we all have a tendency when we're frustrated, when we've had a long day, when we have lots of competing interests on our time, to say something accurate perhaps, but maybe flippant, that we would rather not the customer who we have a long-standing relationship with see. So just use good email hygiene. Have some internal policies and controls. Who's going to be the one that's going to speak with the customer, who has authority to do this? And having the policy doesn't do you much good if you don't actually follow it. So have some internal process. A lot of times where we see people get in trouble is that the people who know the most information are the people on the ground, the people who are in the field, the people who are working with the customer every day. But what happens is the people who are communicating, giving notice under a contract is a more senior level manager or an executive or somebody from accounting or somebody from legal, and they're giving, and there's a mismatch, and there's not a way, they don't have an internal policy of how this information is going to be handled, and then controls to make sure that they're accurately doing all the things that we just talked about. And that really comes down to just coordination and supervision. Does the accounting department know what the people in the field are doing? Do the field people know how this is impacting accounting? It's like, we're not getting paid. You guys keep dumping more and more T&M time in, but we don't have an agreement with the customer about who's paying for it. Is there coordination, and are you supervising the various parts of your business to make sure that they're all aligned? And then accounting and record keeping. I think BJ and I both have been involved in trying to resolve disputes and claims where the biggest problem is nobody kept very good records at the time. And it's really hard to go back and recreate that information, especially in a fast-moving dynamic project. So when it's a change, for example, the owners decide to change direction on a particular HDMI, separating that time out that was spent on that issue compared to all the kind of base contract work If you don't do it that day, it's almost impossible for us to recreate later with any sort of accuracy. And so having some sort of process where, hey, again, to be event-oriented and not loss-oriented, we know this thing happened. It's going to impact our costs. We don't know all the details yet, but we need to start keeping data and information about it now, because we'll never be able to recapture that information later. And then look a little bit about what you call the flow down provisions, right? These are, let's say you're sub-tiered. There's a general contractor, there's some sort of master planner, some sort of firm that's got a relationship with the end user customer, and you're being retained by them. You don't have a direct contract with the customer. Well, they're probably flowing down all those terms down to you. So, have you even seen those documents? And same thing, going the other way, flow up requirements, right? In other words, you have to give notice within X days, to BJ's point before. That may be in a different document than your actual agreement, your proposal, your terms and conditions, but it may be incorporated as a requirement that you kind of have to do the same thing going upstream. And with your suppliers and vendors, if they're saying, hey, we're spot shipping. We're not going to give you any firm commitment on shipping dates yet. For 2022, we just don't know. Can you flow up that obligation or that restriction into your counterparties? So making sure that these all align. Talk to insurance. Some claims are insured, and if you're part of the CSA insurance program, give a call to Gloria or to others and say, hey, here's what's happening. Can you give me some advice? Do I have insurance for this? Obviously, bodily injury and property damage claims are almost always insured in one capacity or another, but you may have broader insurance for that to cover some of engineering risk, design risk, programming risk, and cyber risk. And you should talk about that. Just like your contracts, you may have pretty strict time periods in which to report those before you start losing some of those insurance rights. And are there any third-party rights or deadlines? So do you have, for example, you're not getting paid, do you have mechanics lien rights in the state? Are you considered a construction contractor because you're touching electrical systems? Some states, yes, some states, no. What kind of rights do you have? Are there other financial instruments that could get you paid? Some sort of a bond, some sort of a letter of credit, especially if it's overseas shipments. Is there some sort of letter of credit arrangement to make sure that there's a remedy if those items aren't shipped and delivered properly? And then don't forget, BJ was talking before about you got to give notice. You got to give it promptly. It's got to be accurate. You got to comply with the contract. But don't forget, that's not a one-step process. Once you report it, you got to sometimes continue to report. So when we're talking about force majeure provisions, for example, often it's you got to report within X number of days from when the event happens or the circumstance happens that's delaying you. And then you got to provide routine updates on how that's impacting the schedule. You got to let us know when it stops. So those are all items to kind of to keep a look at. So we did a pretty good job about nailing this right at 11:58. So I think the questions that have been submitted in either the Q&A or the chat, I believe we've had answered, but we do have a couple of minutes. I also included here both BJ and I's contact information, and to Jose's point before, you are all, if you're a CSIA member, automatically enrolled in the CSIA legal plan, which gives you access to BJ and me and Mark and the rest of the automation robotics team here at the firm. You have discounted legal services available as a benefit of being a CSIA member. So if there are questions, concerns that you have regarding supply chain disruptions and the items that we talked about today, we'd love to talk more with you about it. All the information is available on controlsys.org at the link below. It's in the member services about the legal plan, and it gives you an entitlement to these discounted legal services that deal with these issues and more. So with that, I think I'm turning it back over to Jose.
So thank you very much, Brian and BJ, for this highly relevant virtual event that we had today. We had last week ITR Economics presenting on the real impact of the supply chain challenges. So this is totally relevant. Thank you very much. I would like to thank also all of you who attended. And in the last minute, I would like to remind you that we continue to provide these valuable masterclass virtual events throughout the rest of the year. We have these ones that you see on the screen. So please visit our calendar and register for them. We try to put them very early on, such that you have them in your calendar. And I would like to thank all of you. Have a great rest of the week, and goodbye.